Hey folks, thanks for coming on today. We're going to take a look in this video at a very simple subject. Why is the DMCA important? So what we're doing is basically pulling back from some of the technical aspects of the law and just looking at it more from the concept of, okay, we have this thing. Why? And what actual benefits does it provide? And we're going to break it down kind of into two specific areas, but we're also going to look at some of the criticisms of the DMCA, which are certainly valid. And so hopefully we'll get kind of a global view. And once you do, maybe you'll have a better understanding as to why the law exists and why it's important to comply with it. So DMCA, we're talking about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, of course. It's a federal law in the United States. Congress passed it in 1998, and it was signed into law by the President Clinton in, let's see, what must have been September of that year. No, actually it was October. October 28th, I believe. And since then, it has pretty much been the foundational law for the internet in relation to dealing with copyright situations. Now, there are actually three aspects of the DMCA. One deals with royalty rates applicable to online music. Second deals with digital rights management systems and schemes. And we're pretty much going to ignore those two because the reason you're probably here and the prominent interest in the law is in section 512, which deals with what are called safe harbor immunity. And so what are these provisions? Well, it's important to understand what they are. So let's use real world practical experience. This video. So you're watching it on YouTube, or if you're not, it's at least up on YouTube on our YouTube channel. When I created this video, obviously it's you can tell from the top class multi-million-dollar special effects that we put a lot of money into that. Obviously this is a whiteboard video, but in some cases it would be something more sophisticated. But let's just pretend that this was a very sophisticated graphic video. And let's say that the highly sophisticated computer rendering there on the right was something that I had actually copied from another site somewhere and added it to the video and then uploaded it to YouTube. So in that situation, that would pretty much be copyright infringement. And the question is then, who would be liable for that? Me? Well, yes, I'm the one who actually did the act. I did the copying, the republishing, and the uploading. So it's pretty hard for me to get out of it. What about YouTube? And the answer under the DMCA is no. YouTube is not liable. And so that's kind of Section 512 in action. Now, what 512 says is that any internet service provider is not going to be held liable for copyright infringement based on content uploaded by users. And so in this case, with this video, I'm the user, and YouTube is the internet service provider. Now, internet service providers are essentially anything that's used to either access the internet or to view information. So websites, internet-connected apps, obviously social media, but also, the service that you use to access the internet. So if you're at home and maybe you're using your cable service, or if you're on your phone and you're using, AT&T or Verizon or something like that. So all those are grouped into that scenario there. And so we have this immunity. So it's very important. But why? Why is it critical? Well, remember, we're talking about 1998 when the DMCA was enacted. And depending on your age, you may have been alive then or not. If you were alive and if you were attempting to use the internet then, you probably remember it being just short of torture. At that time, you accessed the internet by actually placing a phone call through your phone line, your landline in your home, through a modem. And it would connect you to the internet. AOL was probably the most popular service, and it sounded kind of like baby squirrels going through a wood chipper. It was horrible, and we didn't have broadband. Instead, we had this, much slower means of accessing and sending data. And so, if you were online and you tried to download anything like a calendar page or a poster or a photo, anything of that sort, it was incredibly slow. You could literally watch the photo load from the top and then down to the bottom. You could almost, in some cases, almost see the pixels loading one by one. It was something else. It was definitely a form of torture. If you were not around then, if you're too young to have been around then, just imagine there was no smartphones, no tablets, no digital watches. Most of the things that you use to communicate with today did not exist. It was just a whole different world. But nonetheless, in that situation, people in the technical field, as well as WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and government, were trying to figure out, okay, if this thing does get off the ground and fly, if we can get broadband working, which would allow for much quicker data distribution and receipt, we're talking about a whole new medium here that's going to change the world. And to their credit, they were right. I realize how hard that is to believe now when you look at the federal government, but back then, they actually spoke to each other and actually tried to work for the betterment of the country instead of just trying to screw each other over. And so we have a number of foundational laws actually that were created, and the whole goal was to try to support the internet like a baby. They were trying to create a safe environment where the baby could grow. But at the same time, they had to respect the rights of certain parties that had existed before the internet, and that was certainly going to be an issue on the internet. And so in the case of the DMCA, we're looking at a balancing act. And what they're trying to balance is the right of a copyright owner to profit from their work. And on the other hand, they're trying to balance the ability of companies on the internet to basically start and grow without being buried by copyright infringement lawsuits. As well as create a situation where their communication can be exchanged without the overriding copyright idea, copyright infringement threat, if you will, threatening that exchange of information. And they did a pretty good job for all the criticisms the DMCA receives, and there are a couple that are very legitimate. Overall, when you think back to what the internet was at that time and what they were trying to project forward, they got it pretty much right. And so today, we have this kind of balancing act. And there's an old joke in law that if you have an outcome where neither party is happy with it, it's probably fair. And that's kind of what we hear with the DMCA. People who post content aren't very happy with it. Copyright owners aren't very happy with it either. And so therefore, it must pretty much balance their interests. So why is the DMCA important? Well, it's facilitated the growth of the internet, but it's also created a scenario where in the United States, certainly, the internet can grow as a commercial medium, where we have websites that can, or online businesses that can go from an idea to a functional business without being stomped into bankruptcy court by a wave of copyright infringement lawsuits. So let's take some examples. Let's look at some big social media sites. Well, how about Facebook? So what does Facebook do? What does Facebook create? And the answer is nothing. Facebook is essentially a skeletal website, and the meat, if you will, is provided by users. It's a beautiful business model. Facebook doesn't really do anything. They don't really create anything. Now, that's obviously a simplification of it. They do write code and this, that, and the other. But who is providing the content on Facebook? You are, and your friends. You're uploading all this different content and everything of this sort. Well, how does Facebook screen all that? Today it has 2.2 billion users. It's this huge company. But when it started, there was no money. The monetization model for it was non-existent. It was just like millions of startups that are kind of started on an idea and a wing and a prayer, and it starts functioning. And fortunately, in this case, it was able to grow and expand where other social media idea sites such as like MySpace got a little popular and then they kind of failed. Or you look at social media sites like all the efforts that Google's made to launch various social media sites that have just been abject failures, even though they spent probably $500 million on different options, and they've just been a disaster. So typically, most startups are going to fail in any particular niche, but in this case, the DMCA created an environment where at least these startups didn't have to worry about being sued into oblivion by copyright owners. And so the DMCA is very important for that because it allowed these companies to get established. And if you think that that's not important, then just understand that without the DMCA, there is no Facebook, there is no Twitter, there is no Instagram, there is no YouTube. None of these sites exist. And in fact, there's a good chance there's no search engines because search engines are effectively copying and rendering content. That's what search results are. Sometimes they'll add images, whatever it may be. And so the internet would look radically different. And we can kind of see an example of this in Europe. So in the US, we have these laws that are created to try to help grow the internet, and there's really no equivalent in Europe. And so when you look at online businesses, startups, and some of the major online businesses that exist in the world, none of them are based in Europe. You can go to almost any niche and you're not going to find any, maybe one or two. And the reason for that is they don't create that buffer over there. And in fact, there are just tons of regulations, and it makes it a very difficult place to be a startup, particularly in the online environment. And so anybody in Europe who has a good idea or half a brain, typically the first thing to do is leave. They go to a jurisdiction that is more friendly. And so without the protection from, potential copyright infringement lawsuits and things of that sort, their business environment, online business environment has been stifled. So the DMCA is very important for that. Okay, well, maybe you're thinking, commercial mediums, what do we care? I hate Facebook, I hate Twitter. And there's certainly a viable argument for that. Maybe the internet should be purely a communication, platform with no commercial interest. Okay, well, I don't think that's very realistic, but let's just assume that, that's what we're shooting for. DMCA is still incredibly important for that. And the reason is it creates an environment where information is not bottled. It is not limited by the platforms. So let's pretend that we don't have Facebook or we don't have Twitter or any of these exchange sites where people are exchanging information. We would still need some platform in some way where people could meet to exchange information. And let's say it was all political information or whatever. Well, people are still going to upload things. And some of those things are going to still constitute copyright infringement. And so if that platform doesn't have immunity from copyright infringement lawsuits, what is it going to do? It's going to limit the information it allows to be uploaded and exchanged. It's going to throttle free speech. And in the US, we value free speech heavily. Now contrast this with another area, such as Europe. Okay, I don't mean to bag on Europe. It's just jurisdiction most people are familiar with. So right now, Europe is issuing a new copyright regulation. It's January 2019 as I make this. And this new regulation is going to say that online platforms that exchange, quote unquote, large amounts of information, whatever that means, are going to have to filter the content that users upload and exclude any copyrighted materials, or those platforms will be held liable for copyright infringement, or at least exposed to copyright infringement lawsuits. So effectively, they're going the opposite direction from the DMCA. They're saying these sites are all going to be liable. Okay, well, what does that mean for Facebook or Google, or these types of sites and services? Well, it's an inconvenience at a minimum. But, in their case, they're probably going to have the resources to try to handle it. But can they do it effectively? And from what we know so far, the answer is no. And we only have to look in the US at YouTube. YouTube runs its own content ID filtering system, and it's notoriously bad. Google spent like $80 million trying to get the thing to work. And there are endless examples where infringing content has gotten through the filters, and there's endless examples of where non-infringing content has been blocked. And if Google is spending that kind of money, how are the rest of us supposed to deal with this? So if in the U.S., what's the practical effect? Well, the practical effect is that all of these sites that have to comply with that regulation in Europe, they're going to start blocking any questionable content. And an example of what this will mean on from a practical perspective is memes. I like a good meme. You probably like a good one. There's some funny ones. There's some memes that make you think, whatever it is. Well, in Europe, there's a pretty valid argument that there probably not going to be any memes on these platforms, that they'll not be viewable in Europe. And the reason for that is the large platforms, the Twitters and whatever of the world where those would be uploaded. Well, those sites are going to have to screen for copyrighted infringing material. And how are they going to be able to screen memes and know whether the person who created those had a license for all the images or the characters or the people or whatever it is that are portrayed in those memes? And the answer is, as far as I know, there is no way to know. And so what is the platform going to do? It's going to block it. It's not going to show it to the public. And so if you're in Europe, you should expect memes and other similar types of content to vanish. And the Europeans are very short-sighted in this regard. They've issued a privacy regulation, the GDPR, that was issued in May of 2018. And, in their arrogance, they're demanding all these different compliance requirements that are very onerous. And to their surprise, a lot of sites around the world have just decided it's not worth dealing with. And so they block European traffic. And so if you're in London and you try and pull up the Los Angeles Times website, for instance, you get a page that says, "I'm sorry, we don't serve content to you." And the reason for that is they don't want to comply with the GDPR. It's too expensive. And particularly in the news field, monetization is very difficult. We all hear about newspapers dying. Well, the way they monetize their content online is very heavily involved with web beacons and cookies and things of this sort that just don't work under the GDPR. And so the practical effect there is the exchange of information has been throttled. And if the DMCA did not exist in the United States, that would be the effect here as well, because these companies would protect themselves. They are for-profit entities, and that's just kind of the nature of the game. And so they're going to take steps to do that. So it's very important in that extent to support the free exchange of information, because these companies don't have to worry about copyright infringement. And then you upload a document, of a political nature or something. Well, they don't care. Exchange it. Have at it. But if they have to be worried about being sued for copyright infringement over that document, then they're going to block it. And that's going to hurt free speech. And in the U.S., at least, we value free speech. So does that mean the DMCA is a wonderful law and we should all bow before it and give thanks that it exists? Well, yeah, in general. But that isn't to say that there aren't haters and critics. Now, as far as the haters go, I'm going to be honest. I think there are a lot of people online who are just not happy in their lives and they just want something to complain about. And when I'm referring to haters, I'm referring to people who complain about things and don't offer a solution. And so you see a lot of people say, "Oh, the DMCA is this horrible law. It should be unconstitutional." Blah. And, they complain and complain and complain. And then you say, "Okay, well, that's great. So what would you replace it with?" And then they come up with nonsensical things. All information and data should be free. Really? So the novelist who just spent 6 months writing a book, you're telling me at the end of that process, he or she has to give away their book for free? They're not going to make any money off of that. So they're not going to be able to write another book because obviously nobody's going to do something, over that time that takes that amount of effort and focus that they're not going to make some money off of. And it's not that they're writing the book because they're hoping to become rich, but most writers, I think it's safe to say, want to make enough money that they can write the next book. And so this whole free flow of data thing is just nonsense. And on the other side, it's you have haters on the copyright side too. Websites should have to filter everything. I don't think it's any secret that if the music or movie industry had their way, nobody would ever be able to upload anything on the internet. They're just, they're so protective of their content and have wasted so much money on these issues that they're kind of twisted at this point. But what about legitimate criticisms? Well, there are definitely two that come to mind. For copyright owners, there's a whack-a-mole situation. If you have content online, there's a good chance it's going to get stolen, particularly the more popular it gets. So if you're writing a book or something of that sort, or let's say you create a course, unfortunately, people are going to copy it, republish it, and try and resell it elsewhere or make money off of it one way or another. And you could easily end up spending all day sending takedown notices and searching for your content and trying to get it removed from sites. It is very frustrating. It is very frustrating if you find it on Twitter and you send a takedown notice because, Mr. Copyright Infringement, has listed it in his Twitter feed and they take it down. And then a couple of minutes later, you see it on Mrs. Copyright Infringement's Twitter feed, and you send a takedown notice and they take it down. And you just end up doing this all day because it pops up in 50,000 different places. And that is, there's no real solution for that under the DMCA. And it's extremely frustrating, and it's a legitimate criticism. Unfortunately, I don't really know what the solution would be. I can't think of a practical way to deal with that other than to have websites filter all their content like Europe is doing. I think that that's just a really bad choice because it really limits the flow of information, and I think it could really hurt startups. But maybe others will feel differently. But anyways, that is a very legitimate criticism. Now, another criticism, of course, is on the other side. What if you're posting content? Well, it's no secret out there that a lot of companies, particularly the larger ones, they don't manually go hunt for their stolen content. Instead, they use software. Some of the software is very sophisticated. Some of it is not. The situation where it's not leads to poor results. And so what will happen is this software will go out and look for a combination of perhaps keywords. And when it finds those combinations, it will identify the website, the host, and the offending page. And then it sends takedown notices to your host and let's say to Google and Yahoo, and demanding basically that the page be removed from the search engine rankings, and that, with your host, that the page or the website be taken down. And the problem with that is there's no evaluation as to whether the use of the content is actually legitimate under a fair use defense. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you go out and, let's use an example from my life. It is January 19th, last night. The missus and I watched a movie on Netflix called I.O. And it was, what's the word? Horrible. Incredibly boring. And I mean, it wasn't terrible, but it could have been a 15-minute movie. It was just like, really? That was the movie. Okay, I'll never get that hour back in my life. But nonetheless, let's say that I was so repulsed by it that I went on to a blog. I created a blog for movie reviews. I write a review, and I go watch the movie again, and I write down a conversation between the two main characters, and I post it as part of the review saying, and this is an example of how stupid this movie was. Here's this inane conversation. And so I post it word for word. Well, the software, that Netflix would use, and I don't actually think Netflix uses software, but let's just assume that they did. It goes out and it sees those phrases. And so it knows that I've taken this text out, and it would file a DMCA takedown notice with the host of my blog. Okay, well, am I infringing on the content of Netflix? No. Criticism is a fair use defense. It is recognized. It is a standard copyright infringement defense. Very well recognized. If you go on to YouTube and you do, pick your favorite movie or your favorite book, and then, plus review, hit enter, you're going to get a bunch of results. And that's because as a society, we've decided we want to promote criticism. It's a valuable part of our society. And criticism doesn't necessarily mean negative criticism. It can be positive too. This is the greatest book I've ever read, whatever it is. But we allow for those kinds of things. Now, what are my rights at that point? Can I go back against Netflix and sue them, for trying to get my website taken down? And the practical answer is no, not under the DMCA. So there's really no negative implication for them to abuse the DMCA takedown process. And a lot of companies do. I'll give you an example, a funny one, Microsoft. There was a period of time where Microsoft was apparently using new software, and they hadn't really dialed it in yet. And so they had sent out press releases promoting their products, maybe a new product. I don't even remember what product it was because it was so damn funny that you didn't even focus on the product. But let's say they send out this press release. And now what's the purpose of a press release? Well, it's to get the news out there. And so they send it out through all these services. And maybe this press release ends up on, 10,000 websites. Okay. Well, now their DMCA, copyright infringement software that they're using isn't dialed in correctly, and it starts identifying the press releases as infringing content. And so Microsoft starts sending takedown notices under the DMCA compliance process to all these sites who have listed its own press release. It was complaining about its own press release. and and so, of course, people start commenting on like, "What the hell are you doing?" And then Microsoft figured it out, and I'm sure somebody probably got fired, but it was just shows just the massive abuse that occurred. Now, did those websites have any practical recourse against Microsoft? No, not really. Now, if you're a DMCA nerd, you're no doubt thinking about 512F. And so if you're not a DMCA nerd, I apologize. I'll try and explain it in plain English. There is a section of the DMCA, 512F, that says that in the case of an abusive DMCA takedown notice, that the person affected by it can, in fact, sue the copyright owner for damages. And that sounds great, but there's a problem. The standard that is used in determining whether the abuse occurred is subjective. It's not objective. And they're looking at the subjective thoughts of the person who filed the takedown notice. And so if that person gets on, let's say Microsoft kicks out a clerk and he gets up on the stand and I say, "Dear clerk, you filed this copyright claim or copyright takedown notice that is, completely abusive. Can't you see in my movie review as criticism and as a standard defense?" And that clerk says, "You know what? I realize that now, but at the time that I filed the complaint, I thought it was legitimate. I didn't realize, that really it was a movie review. I thought this was more like an advertisement and you were trying to use our content to make money." And his answer is complete nonsense, total 100% nonsense. Do I win the case? And the answer is no, because it depends on his subjective view, not his objective view. So not what I or a jury would think was right, but instead, what did he think at that time? And as you can imagine, most of the employees of these companies are going to get up there and say, "I thought it was legitimate," no matter how much of a bold-faced lie that is. And now at this point, you might be saying, "But people are supposed to lie on the stand." And okay, welcome to the real world. They do all the time, particularly if they want to keep their job at these companies. So that is a very legitimate criticism of the DMCA. So you have criticisms on both sides. Is there any effort to fix these? Not at this point. Unfortunately, we haven't seen even a remote hint of interest from Congress because, of course, in 2019 in January, the government shut down, and the sides don't look like they could agree on whether it's sunny outside at this point. So I wouldn't expect any changes to copyright law for at least a decade. So it is what it is. So why is the DMCA important? It's important because it helped the internet grow, and it continues to help startups get off the ground without worrying about being crushed by copyright infringement lawsuits. And it's also important to the free flow of information online. Simply by eliminating the threat of copyright infringement lawsuits, platforms don't clamp down on data that their users are trying to post. And so that's a huge benefit. I mean, it really can't be understated. Is the DMCA a perfect law? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There's some serious problems with it, and they really need to be fixed. But at the end of the day, if you think about what the internet was like in 1998 when they created the DMCA and drafted it, when everybody was on dial-up modems and you could barely get a photo to download, they did a pretty good job. When you look at it here 20 years later, and data moves at the speed of light, and people are watching movies on their smartphones and things like that. That was science fiction stuff 20 years ago when they were drafting this law. So for all the critics out there, take a chill pill, relax a bit. They did a pretty good job. So thank you for watching today's video. Obviously, our channel is devoted to DMCA topics. So if you're interested, please, feel free to subscribe and check back frequently. We'll be posting videos all the time. If you are an online business owner, if you own a website or an app, and you want to comply with the DMCA to take advantage of that immunity, you should. You are going to have to list an agent. If you don't want to list your own personal information online, feel free to contact us at dmcaagentservice.com, and we'll be able to help you out. So y'all have a good one. See you later.